A man says four words on television. 50 years later, those four words are tattooed on strangers' arms, printed on posters in gyms that have nothing to do with martial arts, quoted by people who couldn't name a single Bruce Lee film. Almost none of them know where the words actually came from. Almost none of them know the question that produced the answer. Hong Kong, December 1971. A small television studio rented for the afternoon. Bruce Lee sits across from a Canadian broadcaster named Pierre Berton, a man known back home for interviews that made even guarded people say more than they intended. This is not a movie set. There's no crew of dozens, no choreographed fight, no stunt team, just two chairs, a camera, and a conversation that almost no one alive today has watched in full. Bruce is 31. He has just finished The Big Boss in Hong Kong, a box office success that hasn't yet reached North America. In the US, he's still mostly known, if at all, as the sidekick from the Green Hornet. This interview will later be lost for over 2 decades, misplaced in an archive, rediscovered only in 1994. But right now, in this room, nobody knows that. Berton has done his homework. He doesn't ask the questions Bruce is used to fielding from American press. Questions about kicks, about stunts, about whether the fighting is real. Berton asks about identity, about race, about what it costs a Chinese actor to try to become a leading man in an industry that has already decided what a leading man looks like. Bruce answers carefully at first, measured. This is a man who has learned the hard way, which sentences get repeated back to him out of context. He talks about growing up in Hong Kong, about the strange dual pressure of being seen as too Western when he's home and too foreign when he's in America. Berton listens without interrupting, the way a good interviewer does when he senses the real material is still a few questions away. Off camera, a single overhead light hums faintly. The room is small enough that neither man needs to raise his voice. There's no studio audience, no cutaways, no second unit filming reaction shots. Just the two of them, and whatever gets said stays said, unedited, for whoever eventually watches the tape. There's a moment partway through where Berton shifts the conversation somewhere unexpected. He doesn't ask Bruce to explain his philosophy from scratch. He asks him to remember something. Can you remember the lines that express your philosophy? It's a specific request. Berton isn't asking Bruce to invent an answer on the spot. He's asking him to recall something. Words that already exist somewhere, that Bruce has said before, in another context entirely. Bruce pauses. Then, oh, I remember them. What he recites next is the version of Be Water that will circulate for the next 50 years, the version people will quote as if it was spoken here for the first time as spontaneous personal philosophy pulled straight from Bruce Lee's own mind in that exact moment. That is not what's happening in this room. Months earlier, Bruce had been working on an American television series called Longstreet, playing a martial arts instructor named Lee Tsung, teaching the blind lead character how to fight. The words Bruce recites for Berton were not born in this studio. They were written months before, for a scene in that show, by a screenwriter named Sterling Silliphant. Here's where the story most people tell gets it wrong, and where it also gets more interesting than the simple version. Silliphant didn't invent the water metaphor out of nowhere. He and Bruce had spent real time together before the Longstreet scripts were finalized. Bruce had, by his own account, and by accounts of people close to him, been talking for years about water as the closest physical metaphor for the kind of fighter and the kind of person he was trying to become. Formless, adaptable, taking the shape of whatever it meets without losing its essential nature. Silliphant listened to those conversations. Then he sat down and wrote a monologue for a fictional character named Lee Tsung, built almost entirely out of Bruce's own recurring language, and handed the finished pages back to the man whose ideas they were. So when Bruce delivers the words on screen in Longstreet, he isn't performing someone else's invention. He is speaking his own philosophy, filtered once through another writer's pen, then spoken back through his own mouth and body, and months later, sitting across from Pierre Berton when he's asked to remember the lines, what he's really doing is retrieving a script, one built from his own real convictions, refined by someone else's craft, and now being folded back into a live, unscripted conversation about who he actually is. Most retellings collapse all of that into a single, cleaner myth. Bruce Lee, philosopher, spontaneously produces timeless wisdom on television. It's a better story in the way that all flattened stories are better. Simpler, more mythic, easier to put on a poster. The real version is stranger, and if you sit with it, more honest about how philosophy actually moves through a person's life. Bruce didn't wake up one day with a fully formed doctrine. He lived with an idea for years, in private, in training halls, in conversations with people who were paying attention. A professional writer helped him find a sharper shape for it. And then, when a stranger with a camera asked him to explain himself, he reached for the sharpest version he had, not because it was invented in that instant, but because it was, by then, fully his. This matters for a reason that has nothing to do with trivia. Somewhere in your own life, there's probably a version of this same layered process happening, and you likely think of it as less legitimate than it actually is. An idea you've carried around half-formed for years. Words someone else helped you find for it. A mentor, a book, a conversation that reshaped how you talk about something you already believed. A moment later where you're asked to explain yourself, and you reach for the clearest version available, worried it doesn't count as really yours, because you didn't invent every word of it alone, in isolation, on the spot. Bruce Lee's most famous sentence went through exactly that process. Years of private conviction, someone else's pen, then his own voice reclaiming it under pressure. Live, with no second take. Nobody watching the Berton interview in 1971, and almost nobody watching the clip online today, experiences it as secondhand. It plays as pure Bruce Lee, because by the time he said it to Berton, it was. The lesson isn't that originality is fake, or that it doesn't matter where an idea comes from. It's that the line between genuinely yours and shaped by someone else is far blurrier than the myth-making version of any story wants to admit. Bruce didn't diminish the words by borrowing back his own philosophy through another writer's craftsmanship. He proved something instead, that an idea only becomes truly yours once you're willing to stand behind it, unscripted, in front of a stranger who might ask you anything. Ask yourself what your own equivalent of that moment is. Some belief you hold that you're quietly embarrassed didn't originate entirely inside your own head, that you picked up from a teacher, a friend, a book you didn't write, a conversation you didn't start. The instinct is to feel like that makes it borrowed, lesser, not fully earned. Bruce Lee's answer to that instinct is on film, in a small studio in Hong Kong in December 1971. He didn't invent the metaphor alone, in isolation, in that room. He simply owned it completely by the time it mattered. And that, not the poetic imagery of water in a cup, is the actual philosophy worth remembering. He never claimed the words were born in that chair. He just refused to let where they came from make them any less his. 2 years later, Bruce would be dead at 32, and this same footage would sit forgotten in a vault for over 20 years before anyone thought to look for it again. By the time the world rediscovered it in 1994, the myth had already hardened into place. A spontaneous genius, a single unscripted flash of brilliance. Nobody rewriting that myth was lying exactly. They just never asked the one question that mattered. Where did the water first come from before it ever reached the cup?